It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us is Dr. Mary O'Callahan. She's from Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. She's testified before the Indiana State Senate in favor of legislative restrictions on disability selective abortions, as well as testified before the United Nations concerning the scope of international abortions of children with Down syndrome. Co-founder of Miriam's Blessing, which is doing great work in the diocese. I could go on all day with stuff that you've been doing, but I'm so excited to talk to you this morning. Thanks for being here, Dr. O'Callahan.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm really happy to be here.
How long have you been part of the pro-life movement or considered yourself to be pro-life?
Oh, sure. Kyle, I was really fortunate to grow up in a very pro-life family. I was 8 at the time of Roe v. Wade, and my mother, who was a nurse, started volunteering right away for Birthright, which was the Right to Life organization out in Oregon. This was before Crisis Pregnancy Center, so my mom helped staff a pregnancy hotline. So being pro-life was just part of my childhood. When I went to Catholic high school and college, in the 1980s, there was very little pro-life activism among young people, as there is now. But when I came to graduate school at Notre Dame in the late 80s, as you know, the former abortion clinic in South Bend was right next to Notre Dame.
Sure.
So you can't really ignore it. And I came occasionally with my friends to pray or to protest. I did some volunteering for St. Joseph County Right to Life then. And later in the 90s, I did some work for the Women's Care Center, collecting and analyzing some of their data. You could say, though, that I was always pro-life, but only probably moderately involved in the pro-life movement until a little over 10 years ago when my son Tommy was born with Down syndrome. And then I felt very personally compelled to speak up to defend the lives of children with disabilities who tend to be disproportionately the victims of abortion.
And that is definitely the case today. Has it always been the case? I mean, was this an issue 10 years ago, too?
I think things started changing 10 years ago. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists changed their general recommendation. So before that, they recommended that parents who were over 35 get tested or get screened for genetic problems with their children in utero. And about 10 years ago, it changed, and they recommended that all parents get the screening done. So certainly, I think there's more of a pressing problem, or the problem began to be more pressing, I think, about 10 years ago.
And we obviously would not recommend people get screened for the option of abortion, but how do you feel about screening in general, about finding out if your child is going to have any kind of special medical needs or physical disabilities?
I think that there's reason to get screened if there's really a medical reason. So, for example, if you live in a rural area, right, where it may be necessary to seek good medical care when your child was born with a disability, then certainly there's a good reason. You could say that there's a reason for screening just so you can be prepared for the child's disability. But data doesn't really show that it makes much of a difference, just in terms of parents' preparedness, that the parents tend to do fine either way. And so I think the problem is that it's become such a routine part of medical care that parents just do it automatically without thinking about why they're doing it. And once they do it and find out that there's a problem with their child, there really are not many options, right? There's not really many treatment options for the kinds of disorders that we screen for. And so parents feel very pressured to have an abortion. And so I think in general, right now, the way that we screen, when we screen for disorders for which there's no treatment, is very problematic. And I don't think that there's a lot of good reasons for the screening that we're doing right now.
The pressure that you talk about to get an abortion, is that internal pressure that people feel because their anxiety about dealing with a disability, or is it external pressure that's put on by society, by doctors and nurses and things like that?
I think it's both, honestly. I think that the very fact that we screen says that there's something so wrong with having a child with a disability that we better know, right, before utero. And then the presumption is that we better do something about it. Why else would we screen? And with no treatment options on the table, the obvious option seems abortion. So there's certainly external pressure, and there's always internal pressure as well, because parents are very afraid, right? It's absolutely and typically normal to be afraid when you get a poor prenatal diagnosis. And in fact, this is the reason why most parents abort, I think, is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of suffering, fear that they won't have the time and resources or energy to take care of a child with a disability. So I think you have both internal and external pressures operating.
Do you think as abortion has become illegal and more prevalent in society, that availability has had an influence over people's view of those with disabilities?
You know what, Kyle, this is a really interesting question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. I was talking to my daughter about this yesterday, and she said, there hasn't been any change in the way we view people with disabilities. Before abortion was legal, we institutionalized them, right, because we didn't know how to deal with them. And today we kill them if we can identify them early enough. Wow. And I think she's right to a certain extent. And in both instances, the real horror of our treatment of those with disabilities is concealed. In the case of institutions, the individuals were hidden from our sight, behind gates or walls, and so we were blind to the suffering they experienced. And now our killing of these individuals takes place hidden in a mother's womb and also hidden under the guise of medical care, right, and euphemistic terms like therapeutic induction or some such, sort of words. And the difference, though, is that what we are doing today is worse. Certainly because it involves the taking of life, which is a more serious evil, but also because I think we should know better, and we do know better at this point. Institutionalization happened because of a certain degree of genuine ignorance, I think. But today we know absolutely that with early intervention and appropriate education and inclusion in families and society, that individuals with disabilities can thrive, and we have the research to back it up. And on the surface, it seems like publicly we acknowledge this. If the media is any barometer, and I think it's a pretty good indicator, we see actors and actresses with disabilities on TV and in movies. We see children with disabilities in toy and clothing ads, right? This reached a high point this year with the announcement that the Gerber baby has Down syndrome. And yet, despite all of this positive publicity and everything we know about disabilities, we are in a very dangerous place because we have today what we didn't have in the 50s and 60s, and that's a huge disconnect between our sort of public attitudes towards those with disabilities and our very real behavior when it's put to the test of a prenatal diagnosis. And this is really frightening because everything looks fine on the surface, and yet underneath is the chilling reality that we are killing the disabled. And I don't think that we are going to be wholly prepared for the time when this reality comes out into the open and begins to threaten children who are already born. And this is maybe why the Charlie Gard and the Alfie Evans case has really stunned us. But I think we have to know that if parents don't value the lives of their children, we can't expect the state to, right? Even in cases such as these when the parents were desperate to keep their children alive. Anyway, so to come back to your question, I think on the surface it looks like we have improved, right? Since abortion became legal, that our attitudes towards those with disabilities have improved. But again, I think this is very much on the surface, and I think we need to look at what's really happening in the field of medicine to understand our real treatment of those with disabilities.
We're talking with Dr. Mary O'Callaghan, who's going to be a speaker at the 27th Annual Right to Life Benefit Dinner. It's taking place on Thursday, September 20th for the St. John County Right to Life banquet, and RSVPs are actually due today. So if you're interested in going, if you're able to go, definitely go check out prolifemichiana.org. But I want to talk to you a little bit more about this. What would you say to parents who either want an abortion or are pressured to have an abortion after a disability is diagnosed during pregnancy?
Right. I would say be not afraid. As I said before, most parents end up aborting their children because of fear, all kinds of fears. And these fears are perfectly normal and reasonable when faced with an unexpected diagnosis. But on the other side, you have parents who have gone through this. They've experienced the exact same fears. But then after the baby was born, they fell in love with their child, as all parents do. Yeah. And then somewhere along the way, they realized that not only were their fears not realized, but that, and not only that everything was just okay, but in most cases, they find that the life they have with their child is better than okay. Because this child brought not only unexpected difficulties, which is certainly true. I don't want to sort of sugarcoat the reality of a disability, but along with these difficulties came also very unexpected gifts. And so I think what is necessary then is to bridge the sort of deep chasm between the fear that parents experience when they're carrying a child and the reality of having a child with a disability. And this is where I think we as parents who've experienced this can help. We can witness to the truth of the goodness of our children's lives and the real joy they bring, and encourage expectant parents to take this leap of faith, to sort of listen to us. And, we have no reason, not to be truthful about this.
Yeah, and how can we be more supportive of people with disabilities, of families that are dealing with some of those struggles? But also, I think some of this would just trickle down to the preborn. If we have a better respect and understanding for children, adults that are dealing with this.
So what I think needs to happen is that we have to make sure we're going beyond sort of an easy sentimentality, right? It's easy to pat ourselves on the back because we smile at a cute child with Down syndrome, in a Target clothing ad and think we're doing fine. But real acceptance and support means opening ourselves up to the demands of real relationships with persons with disabilities. To truly understand the gift of people with disabilities, which I think is the only way to resist the desire to destroy them, requires a lived experience, right? Sharing your life and friendship in some way with a person with a disability. Through this friendship that we understand the real struggles and difficulties of the other person, but we also come to receive the gift of the other person, which I think in most cases will sort of take your breath away, with the beauty. And it's hard to know, Kyle, how to advocate for this in a really general way. So I often say, the best place we can start is within our own church, within the Catholic Church. In 1978, the U.S. bishops issued a statement calling for the inclusion and participation of those with disabilities in the church. And 40 years later, we're still struggling with how to implement it. I just finished up this past week giving up talks for Catholic School Mission Days in our diocese, and I make a case for greater inclusion of children with special needs in Catholic schools. We need to give really serious thought to why we ask families to embrace children with disabilities, but often fail as a church to embrace them, in our parishes and in our schools. And, if we had such inclusion, this would, allow the opportunity for more friendships to develop, right? And I think we'd be motivated to advocate for, preborn children with disabilities as well. So I think the best place to start is within the church, figuring out how to better include people with disabilities.
Well, to hear more from Dr. O'Callaghan, definitely go to the Right to Life benefit dinner, which is happening for the St. Joseph County Right to Life, and the RSVPs are due today, but the banquet will be on September 20th at the South Bend Century Center, and it's going to start with a 5 p.m. social hour, 6:30 p.m. dinner and program. Find out information at prolifemichiana.org. Do you have any insight on what you'll be speaking about at the dinner?
I'm going to be probably reflecting on the gift of people with disabilities, giving examples from my own life and research, and really trying to help people appreciate, the joy of life with people with disabilities. But I would also put in a plug for my co-speaker. I'm really going to be the backup singer, Kyle, to our main speaker, who is Katie Shaw. She is a young woman with Down syndrome, and I met her when I was testifying in front of the Indiana State Legislature, and she developed a beautiful pro-life speech. So this is why you really need to come to the banquet, is to hear Katie Shaw speak.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Mary O'Callaghan, for joining us today, and encourage people to check out prolifemichiana.org for information about that banquet. Also, our thanks to Notre Dame Federal Credit Union for underwriting this show and for their support. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Until then, remember to leave room for the Holy Spirit.